A crazy deed goes wrong. Some people thought Crazy Eddie Muldoon and I were to blame for breaking Rancid Crabtree's leg. Oddly, the odorous and crotchety old woodsman himself was one of the people who thought this. He said as soon as he got off his crutches, he intended to run Eddie and me down and weld the tar out of us. But we weren't too worried. We figured by the time Rancid got out of the cast, he would have cooled off enough to see that the accident was really his own doing and not our fault at all. But before he got off his crutches, the little incident with the bobcat occurred, generally confusing matters even more. As Crazy Eddie observed at the time, you try to do a kind deed for a person and it just gets you into more trouble. Anyway, here are the true facts about the entire mess. During our Christmas vacation from third grade, Eddie and I built a toboggan run up on the mountain behind Rancid's shack. The design of our run was based on one that we had seen in newsreels at the Pandora Theater the Saturday before. The two runs were almost identical, except ours was steeper and faster than the one in the newsreel, and it went over and under logs and had brush on both sides of it, and at least one of the turns was much sharper, and if you didn't make that turn, you would be shot off into space and sail for some time over the valley looking down at the tiny cows and cars beneath you, and this in turn might elevate your anxiety to a dangerous level. So you wanted to be sure to make that sharp curve. We built the first part of the run on an old logging road that zigzagged down the mountain. We tramped up and down the road the distance of two switchbacks, packing down the snow into a track slightly wider than the width of our sled. The grade on the switchbacks was modest, but sufficient to build up a fair head of speed in a sled by the time it and its driver reached the curve at the end of the second switchback. Then came the good part. Instead of curving the track onto the next switchback, we funneled it over to the edge of the road into an old skid trail. The skid trail had been gouged into the mountain by old-time loggers dragging logs down it. In fact, it was so steep they probably didn't have time, or they didn't have to drag the logs, but merely had to roll them into it and let them shoot to the bottom of the mountain. Erosion had cut the trail down to bare rock, which was now coated with ice, making it even better for a toboggan run. When we were building up our curved bank, when we were building up our curved bank to funnel the track into the skid trail, Eddie slipped and nearly shot down the run with nothing but his body, and would have if he hadn't managed to grab a small tree and pull himself back up. "Wow," he said. "This is going to be good." At the bottom end, the skid trail intersected with the next switchback of the road. This was where the toboggan driver would shoot off into space if he failed to make the turn into the switchback. Fortunately, there was a high bank on the downhill side of the road, only slightly offset from the track. The driver would have to be alert enough to steer toward the high bank, which would sweep the sled up and around and then redirect it back down onto the switchback. This was the last switchback, and it provided a straightway that at the bottom merged with Sand Creek Road. The straightway was quite steep, so the toboggan driver wouldn't have to worry about his speed diminishing any when he hit that last stretch. He could then glide to a gradual stop on the Sand Creek Road, which was seldom traveled during winter, and even then only by old Mrs. Swisher, who drove to church on it each Sunday. We completed the track on a Friday and planned to make our first test run on Saturday. The next morning, Crazy Eddie and I were dragging my sled past Rancid's shack on our way up to test our toboggan run, and were arguing about who would get to go down first. "Listen, Eddie, it's my sled," I said. Yeah, that's right, he replied. That's why you should get to be first to test the run. No, sirree, I said. I should be the one who gets to choose who goes first. And I choose you. About then, Rancid stuck his head out the door of his shack. What you boys up to now? He hollered at us. Some kind of monkey business? No doubt. I ain't never seen no young guns what could get into more trouble than you two. We built a toboggan run up on the mountain, just like in the newsreel, Rancid. It's fast, too. Hold up a sec, he said, putting on his coat. I better go check this out. You full half pints probably invented some new way to kill yourselves. Half an hour later, we stood at the start of the toboggan run, all of us still puffing great clouds of vapor from the climb up the trail. Rancid stared at the little track going down the first switchback. It didn't look nearly so impressive this morning. Shoot, he said, chuckling. You call this a toboggan run? I can't believe I'll climb all the way uphill to see this piddling little trail in the snow. I must have been out of my mind. Give me that sled. The least you can do is let me ride back to the bottom of the mountain on it. I handed over the sled. Ransom plopped down on it, sitting upright with his long legs sticking way out in front, his coat completely concealing the sled that was beneath him. It might be dangerous, Mr. Crabtree, Eddie warned. Dangerous, Rancid said. Eddie, I expect I never told you, but I used to be a professional bobsledder, just like you see in the movies. Racing Rancid, they used to call me. Gee, I said, I didn't know that. I figured that he must have been a professional bobsledder right after being a fighter pilot and before he became a big game hunter in Africa, or about the same time that he was a champion prize fighter. Yep, Ransom said, poking a wad of chewing tobacco into his cheek. Now give me a shove off. He glided slowly away toward the first curve. Gradually picking up speed, he called back to us as he went around the curve. I hate to tell you this, boys, but your bobsled track ain't steep enough even to give a fella a decent ride. We were disappointed in the professional bobsledder's assessment of our run, but thought his opinion of it might improve later on. And sure enough, the next time we heard him, he was yelling about when he thought he should hit the funnel into the skid trail. Golly! I think he liked the skid trail section, Eddie said. Yeah, I said, he sounded pretty excited. So that is how Rancid broke his leg. He said later that he didn't know when, where, or how he broke his leg, or even that he had, because his mind was so occupied with other matters, among which was wailing the tar out of Eddie and me at his first opportunity. The only eyewitness other than Rancid was old Mrs. Swisher, who was a little daft anyway, and really couldn't be relied on for an accurate observation. I got a little mixed up, she said. And thinking it was Sunday instead of Saturday, I started driving in town to go to church. As always, I was especially nervous going by that dreadful Ransom Crabtree shack because he's in cahoots with the devil. Well, I'm driving along real careful, minding my own business, when all of a sudden that fool Crabtree zooms right by me, just flying he was, about a foot in the air, going like the wind. I just caught a glimpse of his face. He was going so fast, and I'm sorry that I did because it had such a hideous expression on it, you can't even imagine. The thought of it has kept me awake nights ever since. And he's holding this little green tree in one hand, torn right out by the roots, it was. I bet the tree had something to do with one of those devilish rites of his. Well, he shot off down Sand Hill. And I thought that he might be laying in ambush for me up ahead, so I turned right around and I went home. And it was a good thing I did, too, because then I remembered it was Saturday instead of Sunday. Well, naturally, nobody took daft old Mrs. Swisher's account seriously. although Eddie and I did recover my sled at the bottom of Sand Creek Hill, where it had shot off over the bank and landed on the frozen creek. Sprayed out in front of it was what we first thought to be blood, but then discovered was nothing more interesting than tobacco juice. A couple of Saturdays later, Eddie and I were walking along the highway pulling my sled, the runners of which were somewhat splayed out but still worked. We had been trying to come up with an idea for making amends with Rancid when he saw a furry shape lying on the highway. Both of us had fine roadkill collections, and this specimen, it looked exceptional. It's mine, I said as we rushed forward. You got the last one. No sirree, Eddie said. I remember. You got that nice flattened toad last fall, and hey, what is this anyway? My goodness, it's a bobcat. Feel it. It must have just been killed. It's still warm. Look, it's got a bit of blood on its head where the car hit it, but otherwise, still in pretty good shape. Well, I better take my bobcat home. Maybe I'll stuff it. No, you won't, Eddie said. I'm going to take it home and stuff it myself. Hey, wait a minute, I said. I know what. We'll give it to Rancid. He can skin it and sell the hide, and then he won't be mad at us anymore. What do you say, Eddie? Eddie reluctantly agreed. We loaded the bobcat on my sled and hauled it over to Rancid's shack. I pushed the door gently open, and I peeked inside to make sure that Rancid wasn't close enough to swat me before he saw what we had brought him. The old woodsman was still in bed, snoring loudly, his casted foot sticking out from under the covers and resting on a block of firewood. He had pulled a red wool stocking cap over his bare foot where it stuck out of the cast. Rancid's still asleep, I whispered to Eddie. Should we wake him up? Crazy Eddie grinned. Nah, he's probably all pooped out from dragging that cast around with him. Let's just carry the bobcat in and put it on the table next to his bed so that he can see it when he first wakes up. It'll be a nice surprise for him. Eddie was very good at thinking up nice surprises for people. We carried the bobcat in and laid it down on the table next to the snoring Rancid. Eddie studied the arrangement. No good, he whispered. It looks too dead. He looked around and found a box of kitchen matches. Then he took out two of the matches and used them to prop apart the big cat's lips in a pretty fair imitation of a snarl. Then he stuck the matchbox under the animal's chin so it looked as if the bobcat were holding its head up, ready to spring. Then we tiptoed out and hunkered alongside the door to await the old woodsman's awaking. I think he's going to be real surprised, Eddie said. Yeah, me too. Presently, Rancid stopped snoring. He muttered something in his sleep. Then he apparently banged the table with his arm because he heard a bump and then sound of the matchbox hitting the floor. Goodness, Eddie whispered. The matchbox fell out from under the bobcat's chin. The surprise is ruined now. Blah! Rancid mumbled. What in tarnation? Oh, get it away from me! Eddie and I chuckled. The table crashed to the floor. A chair was flung against the wall, and a block of firewood sailed out the door. All of this was accompanied by a terrible roaring and snarling and the wildest cussing I'd ever heard. Get back! Get back! Rancid yelled amid all the bangs and crashes and thumps. Eddie looked at me. I didn't think he'd be this surprised. No fooling, I said nervously. Maybe we better leave right now. We can tell him later about our present for him when he isn't so surprised. At that moment, there was a furious rattling of crutches, and Rancid burst out of the cabin, shot across the yard and into his privy, slamming the door shut behind him. Eddie and I were so startled that we couldn't move. Then the bobcat walked out the door, chewing on a matchstick. It gave us a contemptuous glare and went off up to the mountain, shaking its head, either because it had a headache or because it couldn't believe what it had just witnessed. Rancid opened the privy door a crack and he watched the bobcat until it disappeared in the woods. Then he saw us. Crazy Eddie and I started toward home. You ever seen Rancid move that fast before? Eddie asked. Nope, I said, glancing back over my shoulder. Especially not on crutches. Didn't even use his legs, Eddie said, with a touch of awe. Had those old crutches whipping around like spokes on a wheel. Do you think he was ever an acrobat in a circus? Probably. I see he don't sleep in pajamas neither, Eddie said, puffing clouds of vapor into the icy air. Yeah, I said, panting my own clouds of vapor. He probably will after this, though. We passed daft old Mrs. Swisher's car askew on the road below Rancid's shack. She was staring vacantly at us, her mouth hanging open. It's Saturday, Mrs. Swisher, Eddie yelled as we sped past. Sunday ain't until tomorrow. She didn't reply, but I could tell that she was going to have trouble getting to sleep again that night. It isn't often that you see a naked man on crutches with a red stocking cap on his foot chase two boys through the snow on a cold winter morning. What was even stranger, the crippled old woodsman kept gaining on us.